If you've landed on this episode, then all your questions about metabolism, what it is, and how we can maximize it for weight loss and energy are about to be answered. I have Lara Briden, a well-known naturopathic doctor and author of 3 top-selling books that support women's health and hormones. To connect with Lara and access her books, check out her links in the show notes. I want to share some personal information on how your studies and books have positively impacted my family. So my daughter at a young age was diagnosed with PCOS and was put on the contraceptive pill to manage it, but she believes it impacted her mental health, like depression, anxiety. So you and I both did a podcast interview for the Be Pure podcast on a women's health series, and I listened to your episode around contraception. And this is not me saying that contraception is bad. I was on it for 25 years. It was fine for me. But something I picked up was that we do seem to chuck them into the mix to manage menstrual challenges a lot sooner than, say, self-adjusting lifestyle and diet. I recommended that my daughter read the Period Repair Manual, and this changed a lot for her. So she adjusted her diet, she added stress management techniques, she got right into her fitness, which I was super happy about because up until that point, she was like, I don't even know what this fitness gig is all about. It's not what it's cut out to be, and we're in the fitness industry. So she started working on her fitness, and she's now feeling a lot better with her mental health, and symptoms of PCOS have literally disappeared. So welcome to the Sexy Aging Podcast, Lara. Before we dive into the questions I have for you today, and I have a lot, if someone has stumbled across this podcast episode today, what is the one key takeaway that you would want them to know? Put you on the spot.
Yeah. Well, I would say metabolic health does change quite dramatically with the menopause transition. One researcher calls it the metabolic upheaval of menopause. So it's real. The struggle is real, but it is treatable and it's reversed. I mean, it's manageable for sure. We'll explore that in the
And the
questions.
questions,
But I
yeah.
mean, some of it, I'll just say another takeaway, just a quick takeaway. Because I'm an evolutionary biologist before I became a naturopathic doctor. So I'll just say categorically, we humans evolved to go through menopause. So this is not an accident of living too long. We were meant to do this. Good number of our ancestors did this. It's probably, beneficial in that post-reproductive women are so awesome in, family groups, and they kind of keep it all going for everybody. So we're meant to be here past 50, and we're not meant to have symptoms. A lot of those symptoms are from something called evolutionary mismatch, which we can explore.
Wow. I'm so excited. I've got a ton of questions, and I'm sure that a lot of people have just gone, hold up, wait, I'm going to check it out. So we are actually exploring the Metabolism Reset, which I have, and I am making my way through. I'm already taking a ton of notes, and of course I've got questions around it. So let's kick off. And my first question for you today is, please shed some light on what our metabolism actually is, and if you can bust a few myths, because I'm in the fitness industry. I hear a shit ton of stuff, which is it's inaccurate. It's really hard to explain to people what metabolism is. It's very highly scientific. You're throwing in a whole lot of words that probably go right over people's head. Can you help us, Lara?
Yeah. Well, in this book and in general out there, when people talk about metabolic health, what we're talking about quite precisely is insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance. It's really about that. I mean, technically, the word metabolism describes almost anything that, in the body, like all of the, probably, hundreds of thousands of cellular processes that go on are technically part of metabolism, but that's obviously not what we're talking about because that would be insane. So we're really talking about the super common hormonal condition of insulin resistance that has been flying under the radar, in part because it's sometimes called prediabetes, which I've just finally the penny dropped for me. That is, we need to back away from that synonym because when people hear prediabetes, they immediately think, okay, high blood sugar, which is true. But in the early decades of insulin resistance, blood sugar can be normal, or even low at times because reactive hypoglycemia or low blood sugar is a symptom of insulin resistance. And just to boil it right down, the two most sort of frustrating symptoms of the hormonal condition of insulin resistance is increased hunger, kind of constant food noise type hunger, and a reduced ability to access body fat for energy. And that results in what researchers call a cellular energy deficiency. So people are not imagining it. They're like, I need to eat to survive. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm, deeply hungry. And it's because their cells are like, where is the energy? We've used up the glucose from our meal, and we're not accessing our glycogen stores very well. And like, we have to keep going. So then people get in this situation where they're trapped in carb burning. They're trapped having to kind of just keep eating to keep their energy up. And it's really frustrating place to be. And then if you're trapped in that situation, physiological reality, and then you're just being told just eat less, it's like do more. It's like, well, how can you do that when you're like starving and
Yeah.
have low energy? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear this a lot. Like people literally, especially when women come into menopause, they'll say things like, I am literally eating air and working out more than
Yeah.
I ever did, and I cannot
Yeah.
shift this extra fat that I've gained almost overnight. So
Yeah.
it's really frustrating. It's very
Yeah.
confusing. Your book totally breaks it down. I mean, you've given a 5-minute summary on a couple of the initial chapters, of
Yeah.
which you write about it beautifully. Like anybody could understand what this is,
Oh,
and genuinely feel
thanks.
really good
Yeah.
about it, and understand that a lot of people are experiencing this and you're not doing anything wrong, you
Correct.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a little bit of a savior in that way. Can you explain the concept of metabolic inflexibility and why it's particularly important for women to understand this?
Yeah, it's almost synonymous with insulin resistance. Technically, it's just a little bit nuanced difference, but it's essentially just another word for what I've just been describing. Metabolic flexibility is the ability to for cells to be like, oh, we're going to burn glucose, we're going to burn fat, or we've got all this body fat around. We can just, even a person who's not overweight has a actually quite large amount of body fat. Like it should be this energy store that we can just tap into anytime. A colleague of mine describes it as, you could walk, an average sized person could walk from Sydney to Melbourne on their body fat. Like there's, quite a bit there. But unfortunately, like I said, people are trapped out of using it. And so that's what metabolic inflexibility is, being trapped in carb burning, not being able to tap into this like great, store of body fat that our body would like us to use, but we're sort of locked out of it. That's that's the most common situation of metabolic inflexibility. Again, technically the term could apply to people who are kind of locked more into fat burning, but that is like that's a different conversation. That's not really what's out there, what's happening for most people.
Right. So I just want to back it up a little bit and actually have a description of what insulin resistance actually is. So
Yeah.
are we hearing these words sort of in mainstream sort of fitness language, blog posts, you're insulin resistant. What is insulin resistance? And I like
Yeah.
to explain this in a really simple way, but I'd love to hear how you talk about
Yeah.
insulin
We'll have
resistance.
to compare
Yeah.
definitions. And we'll also have to compare maybe what our thoughts on a rebrand, because I
Mm.
mean, I've been talking to my patients about insulin resistance for 25 years. And it's actually, to be honest, it is getting a little easier. But like through all those decades, I've just never found a way to, and I'm still trying to like talk about it where people don't kind of go, that
What?
sounds complicated. Like that's like people are like, that can't apply to me. I'm like, it does. It affects like at least 40% of adults. In
Yeah.
the menopausal age women, it's probably more like 70%.
Yeah.
Like it does apply. And I guess my definition would be the state of chronically elevated levels of the hormone insulin. That is downstream or consequent, the result of reduced ability to use insulin, and that reduced ability varies in different tissues. So I'm shifting it away from that reduced ability or resistance part of the definition to actually it's a hormonal condition of chronically elevated insulin. It's actually the chronically elevated insulin levels that impairs fat burning, that causes metabolic inflexibility. So if people can start to think, right, insulin is high, so one rebranding might be high insulin. I think, that has a
Simple.
sort of better ring to it,
Yeah.
or metabolic dysfunction, which is, as we've described, is a little vague. But if you kind of realize that, like, so one of the best ways to detect insulin resistance is actually to measure the hormone insulin, not glucose. Like
Mm.
one researcher, Benjamin Bickman, who you might have
Yeah.
shared his stuff before, or, I heard him say, and other people have said it, the whole conversation around insulin resistance has been too glucose centric for too long. It's not glucose is part of it, and eventually people can get high blood sugar, but it's actually about the hormone insulin. So how does that compare? How would you define it?
Yeah. No, that sounds really good. When I'm explaining to, say, women in menopause who are what appears to be insulin resistance, I compare the two hormones, sort of estrogen and progesterone, and how it plays into increasing the insulin levels. And just help them understand that this interplay of estrogen and progesterone, as it starts to have its crazy little dance as we go through perimenopause, that it will start to mess with insulin. It's like they were a gang of three, and now they've become a gang of, no, you can't play with us anymore. So I kind of explain it from that perspective where, you know, and estrogen and progesterone, we're going to stay over here and we're not going to play nicely with insulin. You have to exit our playground. So I sort of explain it from that perspective, and then help people understand that there's nothing that they've done wrong, and that we are going to make a few changes to try to help them sort of get back on track and take a long-term view about their health for the future. So that's kind of how I explain it. I mean, it's a lot longer than that in the conversation, but I start from that perspective.
There's another player, if you want to, in your little playground analogy. It's nice, actually. I mean, it's true that estrogen definitely improves insulin sensitivity. So estrogen is like keeping a lid on insulin. Like it's helping quite a lot. It's like a superpower, metabolic superpower. It's like a estradiol is like a metabolic superpower that we have in our reproductive years. But I don't think we're meant to like have high levels of it forever. But we can circle back to that conversation. But the fourth player is testosterone. So and I do talk about this in my perimenopause book, which is a different book than the one you just showed. It's my Hormone Repair Manual, and I touch on it a bit in this book, in the perimenopause section of this book as well. But in women, relatively high levels of testosterone or androgens or male hormones compared to estrogen and progesterone, when testosterone starts to kind of shine through, that promotes insulin resistance in women. So a good way to and that's the situation in perimenopause, and a good way to sort of remember that or situate that is that there's a super common hormonal condition called polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS, or PCOS, depending on how people have heard it described. That is boiled down, that is essentially the situation of androgen excess or relatively high testosterone in women, and that promotes insulin resistance. It becomes a vicious cycle because insulin resistance in women also promotes high androgens. So it's both. But I think so that's one way. Another way to characterize it is that during our reproductive years, both our main estradiol, and progesterone are keeping testosterone down. They're like pushing down on testosterone, and it's allowed on the playfield because we do need a bit of testosterone for sure, because it's great for muscle building and stuff like that. But excess testosterone is actually a pretty big part of the picture, I would say, for the metabolic upheaval of menopause. And it's a combination. It's primarily downstream from lower levels of estradiol, for sure, or estrogen. So
yeah, thanks for elaborating on that, Lara. So if anyone is interested in finding out about more about this, they can check out the Hormone Repair Manual, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Amazing. And of course, as you mentioned, you actually have a chapter in the Metabolism Reset that is about perimenopause. So, I mean, you're covering all the bases, and I think a lot of women would be really, really interested to read and educate themselves on this, especially if it's been a problem for them for some time.
One way to think of it too. So the menopause transition, or perimenopause, or whatever you want to call it, does reduce our insulin sensitivity. So it does, everyone gets shifted a little bit into insulin resistance with this transition, but it just depends on what else was going on. So for women who have like close to zero risk of insulin resistance, that is not a noticeable change that much. I mean, there's different, so it's not just about the female hormones, right? Like there's the underlying, all the other factors that affect insulin sensitivity. And then what happens when we lose that metabolic superpower of estradiol and testosterone starts to shine through, for example, and other things that might be going on. But so just as a really practical takeaway, for anyone who had a history of PCOS or polycystic ovary syndrome, likely, not always, but likely insulin resistance in their younger years, then that's a little red flag. It's like, oh, pay attention. This aspect of health is going to worsen potentially.
Yeah. Awesome. Is there now you got me thinking. I'm going off script here. And I love it. So you got me thinking, and it's ticking over my brain. Is there things that you can do when you're younger? Because I think we are in this conversation as a Gen X woman where we've come up against a menopause conversation that wasn't had when we were younger, right? So now we're pretty angry about that, and we're going, oh, this is the cause of this. This is the reason why I'm putting on weight. This is why I might have insulin resistance. So a lot of women of my age are having this conversation and pretty angry that we weren't given a heads up in advance. So I think part of what we want to do is help women that are about to come into this stage of life. What is it from your experience and the thousands of clients that you've spoken to? What are some of the top things that they could do from a lifestyle perspective that could perhaps prevent the fallout of, say, insulin resistance or metabolic dysfunction?
Right. Well, it's at a younger age, just being conscious of metabolic health. I think just growing awareness of metabolic health and the importance of insulin sensitivity in general for the whole population, for people of either sex or any age, just start to think about and understand will naturally prepare women. So just kind of what I said before, like if you know if you kind of know that every system in our body starts to recalibrate in our 40s, mid 40s on average, depending on the timing of perimenopause for the individual, then you just start to be aware that whatever is going, basically this is probably the simplest way to say it. Whatever is going on with health in someone's 30s is going to just dial up in their 40s, like whatever it is. So if it's like immune problems or kind of struggling with an autoimmune tendency, that might be another common thing that women face. That risk increases. If there's problems with the nervous system and not a great ability to cope with stress and, perhaps sleep disturbances, and that's going to dial up because it's perimenopause in a nutshell is a recalibration of every system. So it's a recalibration, primarily the big three. It's a total recalibration of the nervous system and the brain. It's a recalibration of the immune system, and it's a recalibration of metabolism with a sort of shift to insulin resistance, which, I mean, to be fair, just to contextualize it, like for our ancestors, that shift or recalibration of metabolism wouldn't necessarily have been a bad thing. I mean, it meant actually they could sort of function a little, they didn't have the high sort of calorie or carbohydrate demand that women of reproductive age had, which is good for the group, right? Because it means older women can we can be a little leaner and like give a lot of the best foods to the young women and children who need it. So, I mean, I sort of see it through that lens. Like it was also adaptive. But in answer to your question, how can younger women prepare? Just understand that like it's a good time even before the perimenopause transition to try to optimize health as much as possible. So in my first book, Period Repair Manual, I talk about the period, the monthly natural cycle as a monthly report card. And then in my perimenopause book, Hormone Repair Manual, I do talk about perimenopause being a little like the final exam. So it's like whatever's been going on with your health, suddenly like, okay,
Yeah.
the stakes are, it's game on. Like
Yeah.
you need to, now it's like things are really telling you about it. Like, so whatever's like been going on with your health, it's like, okay, now it's like really going on. And to be fair, for a lot of things that once you get through the perimenopause transition and out the other side, and that's where I am now at like 55, I can just say it's great being on the other side. You do feel like you're kind of a bit more stable. You've just got a bit more leeway. Like you don't have to it's still important to maintain health, but things, once the recalibration sort of is past,
Yeah.
the stakes are not as high anymore. And even the research around the metabolic upheaval of menopause, they call it, it's really, they're talking about the redistribution in fat and the shift in insulin sensitivity that happens around in the later phases of perimenopause. So probably while still cycling, but starting to get a lot less progesterone, for example. And but then once you're like, I think there should be, I talk about the 4 phases of perimenopause in my work. I think there should be like a 5th phase. I think once you're like 3 or 4 years past your final period, there's a new groove. It's like, oh, okay,
I'm so
that's where I
excited.
am. Yeah, that's where I am right now. Actually, I'm 3 or 4. Yeah, my period stopped at 51. I'm almost 55. So yeah, it's like 4 years. It's like, okay, right. Like now I think the recalibration has largely occurred, which is something to look forward to, I think,
Oh,
for people.
there's a moment of hope. I can see the ray of light. So I use something very similar. So I talk about the word menopause and I take the word pause because
Right.
when you bump up against menopause in the form of perimenopause symptoms, it really does it makes you stop. Stop in your tracks because
Right.
whatever you were doing before may not be working. And then you have to
Right.
stop and recalibrate, like you mentioned, things that are going to be better for you for your long-term health. So I think it's actually, if you do take it from a positive spin, it is an amazing opportunity to double down on what's working, what's not working, and carry that through for the rest of your life. Because
Yeah.
post-menopause, we actually need to be freaking healthy if we're going to tick off the bucket list, right? But a
Yeah.
whole lot of things we want to do in our older years, and we don't want our body to not allow us to do that. So the menopause time is a chance to pause, reflect, recalibrate, and then carry on. I'm so looking forward to those the postmenopause years. I'm
Yeah.
probably about, I feel like I'm going to dupe myself, but I'm 9 months without a period. I'm 54 now. I've just got to go 3 more months, thereabouts. But what's happened is my daughter has come home from university, and every time she comes home and she's cycling, I seem to I don't know.
Get a cycle.
I have a cycle. I'm like, please leave my house. I was on
Complete this process.
I was on to a
Yeah.
good thing.
Yeah.
So I find that really interesting as well. But I do look forward to those sort of postmenopausal years. And prior to this conversation, I was a bit dubious. I'm like, oh, am I just going to fade out into oblivion? But I am watching and speaking to a lot of women who have come through the worst of perimenopause, and they've said, hey, actually, this is a good gig. This is a good ride. Let's go, and I find that really inspirational. So thank you for sharing.
Well, and the research backs that up, actually. There's a quote from an Australian research study early in Hormone Repair Manual, where the researchers observed that women in their late 50s and 60s and even into the 70s generally report feeling, quote, pretty fantastic. So, I just love that they pull that quote out of enough of the interviews that it's like, yeah, women are good. Yeah, we're not on, it's not
It's not the
not on the
end.
road to decline. Although I do like your I also talk about the window of opportunity during this transition phase as well. It is a great time to invest in health. It really is, because the payoff could be huge, because it's also perimenopause. It's a tipping point for health. So if you can kind of stabilize, ride out the storm, do well with the recalibration, you can pop out the other side being like, I'm pretty good. You can harness that feeling pretty fantastic,
Yeah.
hopefully.
And because we're
Yeah.
talking about it more now, I am starting to see signs of that, because prior
Yeah.
to that, I wasn't interested when I was in my 40s. B, I'd never heard of it. I
Mm.
knew the word menopause. This is the crazy thing, Lara. 30 years in the fitness industry, never having heard of the effects of perimenopause and how
Mm.
essential it is when it comes to your fitness and your nutrition and everything. So, now I'm just starting to hear about the upsides of postmenopause and having normal everyday conversations. So that's pretty exciting. But I think ultimately what we want to do is be able to educate younger women into how they can maximize, their nutrition, their fitness, their stress reduction, and their sleep, like all the things, gradually habit stacking to a point where it's normal, natural, and they feel amazing. I want to talk about gut health, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a really big question, and I mean, there's so many myths, and you should eat this and don't eat that and what have you. And I think that the gut, from what I understand and for what I've read in your book, plays a huge part in our metabolism, insulin resistance, all the things. So can you just give us a landscape sort of overview of the importance of gut health at this time?
Yeah, I'll do that. And to preface that, I'll just say my approach with the Metabolism Reset, my metabolism book, is, and through my lens, I will just say, and I'm speaking as a biologist, as a naturopathic doctor, working with patients for, what is it, 27 years or something now. Um, it's not metabolic health,
It's
insulin
vegetarian.
sensitivity is not just about finding the right diet and exercise. So obviously diet and exercise and lifestyle habits, as you mentioned, are important. They are important, and they are in many ways the foundation, but it's not the whole story, because metabolic health is an expression of general health. It goes in both directions. So metabolic health actually affects general health in a huge way. It affects mood, for example. But in the other direction,
Excellent one.
anything that's not going well with any aspect of our health can impair metabolic health. So that is why my book had to be a troubleshooting manual. I'll just give another tangible example before I get to gut. But if there's something going on with thyroid, which is super common, in women, if there's Hashimoto's, if there's like a smoldering autoimmune thyroid disease, and people can ask their like older relatives, their mom and their older sisters and their aunties, like, did you have Hashimoto's or did you have thyroid disease? Because it's a genetic tendency. If there's something like that going on, it's going to affect um, metabolic health. If there's something going on kind of with neurotransmitters, I'll just give you an example. I know this is like a big uptick in sort of ADHD awareness, and I'm not an expert on ADHD, but I will just say there's dopamine plays a huge role in metabolic health and hunger regulation. So there's that, right? So I'm just pointing to other aspects of health that can be um, yeah, it can play a role. So that's why some level of that's why people are like, I'm doing everything perfectly. Like I'm following the perfect diet and the perfect exercise and I'm still struggling. And that's because
Mm.
there's something else interfering, what I call in the book metabolic obstacles. So gut is a big one.
Yeah.
There are 10 patient stories in the book. I only realized after the fact, after I wrote the book, that two of the 10 are about gut health. And in one of them, I'm trying to remember her name, but like still remember the patient that she had
Mm.
these like ongoing sugar cravings, like afternoon sugar cravings, which if anyone who's experienced, it's not fun. And you can't like,
It's hard to
y-
break.
you can't just be like mentally, oh, I'm not good. Like you
Yeah.
can for some time, but like eventually, like it's just pretty debilitating actually to be just. So in her case, she'd had that for years. She really battled, struggled, tried to always beating herself up and feeling so ashamed when she did have sugar because she was craving it so badly. And so in that case, I'm like, let's just, because she had other stuff going on. She had like some gut issues that were like, I said, just pause on any micromanaging your diet right now. Let's just like try to treat this gut thing. And then when we managed to find the right treatment, she's like, a few weeks later, it's like, oh, my sugar cravings are gone. That can happen with treating gut issues, just to give a tangible example. And just to give a couple more examples in the section of the book where I talk about what has caused the epidemic of insulin resistance, like seriously,
Yeah.
what has gone so wrong
Yeah.
with the population on a population level where
Yeah.
scientists are like, this is why I say it's not your fault. I mean, we are in the middle of a storm of like something has gone very off the rails with insulin sensitivity. It's a combination of things, certainly, but something's wrong in the food supply, the food environment, what we consider normal foods are doing something bad
Mm.
in the body. And part of that, one of those major mechanisms, I think, is what they're doing in the gut. So there's growing evidence that with ultra refined starches, they do it's a double whammy. They they come into the gut, they don't signal the GLP-1 and other
Right.
satiety signals. They fail to do that. And what they end up doing is just feeding bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine, which is called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or SIBO. And that creates intestinal permeability or leaky gut or inflammation that directly causes insulin resistance through something called metabolic endotoxemia. There's various steps. I mean, it's affecting the visceral fat, it's affecting the liver, it's just toxic. And so, that's a example. So that's why. So one of the mechanisms by which a lower carb diet works. I mean, there's several mechanisms. So, I mean, I do talk a bit about the a low carb diet in the book, and there's all different aspects to it. But like one of the mechanisms by which it works, I'm sure, through my lens as a naturopathic doctor, is by um, treating the gut.
Mm.
So, a low carb diet is a treatment for SIBO or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. That would be a low FODMAP diet, is sort of a version of that. As soon as you stop giving those bacteria where it's sitting where they're not supposed to be, as soon as you stop giving them all the ultra refined carbs that they're just like feasting on, they will die off and
Mm.
relieve some of that bloating and chronic bloating. There's also something else in the food supply that could be contributing to intestinal permeability, and that's emulsifiers.
Mm.
And I've been saying, this is true. Like this is the kind of thing where I'll pop awake sometimes. So no, I'll be honest. Like I do. If I'm in a stressed time, I will pop awake with anxiety thoughts. So full disclosure, like
Yeah.
that happens to all of us. But one of them, I'll be like at 5:30 a.m. It's like, darn, what if emulsifiers are like one of the major drivers of the like insulin resistant epidemic and they're just sitting there below the radar. It's like just happily like in all sorts of foods. It's like, and the reason emulsifiers are not all of them, but some of them are potentially quite bad is they cut through the mucus lining that's supposed to
Oh,
be
wow.
preventing intestinal permeability. So that's just another example of gut. And it's a web, right? Like there's just multiple connections. Like, I mentioned GLP-1, the main satiety hormone. That's a that comes from the gut. And,
Yeah.
there's more research that gut dysbiosis in general, the hydrogen sulfide is this one quirky bit of research where they found hydrogen sulfide from bacterial overgrowth or gut dysbiosis impairs the mitochondria in GLP-1 producing cells
Oh,
in the gut and
yeah.
creates a GLP-1 deficiency, which creates insulin resistance. So those are just, and then plus
Mhm.
the gut, it, drives like autoimmune thyroid disease. Like there's just so many things going on with it. So if I'll just as a just a takeaway, without having to, understand or micromanage or think through or analyze all those different connections, I just a simple thing. If someone is bloating all the time and has digestive symptoms, that is not normal. And that it potentially is a driver of metabolic problems, of hormonal problems, of immune problems. So that becomes quite a priority.
Yeah. I want to ask a really simple question from everything that
Okay.
you've said, but you mentioned a low carbohydrate diet. And I know that my listeners will be like, what is that? Because, we have grown up in quite a diet mentality generation. And of course, with, higher levels of insulin resistance, people being more overweight than before, um, there is a natural tendency to go, okay, I'm going to try this detox or this diet, keto, fasting, all the things, right? So when you say low carbohydrate diet,
Right.
what are you?
How low?
What
I
are we
know.
actually talking about? Like,
How low is low?
what are
Yeah.
we including and what are we excluding? I'm curious.
Well, it's a sliding scale. I mean, you haven't maybe got to that chapter yet, but in chapter 13, I do talk about, I mean, what you're just asking. Well, what is a low carb diet? Well, it depends who you ask. And I guess it depends if you're aiming for ketosis or not. So I'll say, okay, not everyone needs to end up in um, full-time ketosis. I mean, I think, but for anyone listening who has, done well on a ketogenic diet for different reasons, it might not even just be for weight loss, right? Like it can be help with mental health conditions. It's helpful after traumatic brain injury. Like there's just all kinds of reasons potentially why a ketogenic diet is helpful. So that just putting that aside for the moment, because we're not really, you know, I think we don't have time to go into all the nuances of a ketogenic diet, but like back from that upstream, like a lower carbohydrate diet that doesn't result in nutritional ketosis is a sliding scale. So,
Right.
I mean, step one, like I say in chapter 13 of my book, if you just get out just shelter from is the phrase I use, the ultra refined starches
Yeah.
and the like, high dose fructose, and fructose is a carbohydrate. So, step one is just sheltering from those. And then there's, and then it's like, well, I have a section called being realistic about bread? Like, does everyone need to cut bread? No. Do a lot of people need to totally avoid bread? Yes. So, I troubleshoot where are people at with what kind of bread are they having and can they get away with, certainly people without insulin resistance and without autoimmune thyroid disease and without bread is fine,
Mm.
like a good quality bread. But um, it just depends on starting place. So, in answer to your question, how low do you have to go? Like, how long is a piece of string? Like, there's no one size fits all
Yeah.
for that. And certainly people, um, I mean, you can make progress on a sort of a relatively higher carbohydrate situation with a lot of whole foods. I mean, but my experience with patients, and I do share this in chapter 13 of the book, like I'll get people who, because I always ask them what worked for you before, like what just to give me the background so I know, like for that individual biochemistry for that person, what has felt good. I was like, when was the best you ever felt? Like, what were you doing? And very often the answer is low carb diet
Mm.
or paleo or something like that. And then of course then the next step is like, well, which aspect of that were you actually was helping you so much? But and then I find out, and then my next question will be, well, like, well, what stopped you from continuing with that? They're like, well, it was hard. It was hard to organize.
Yeah.
And then a lot of my patients, I'd say the majority of them, or at least the ones who are coming to me later, they don't kind of go from that point of like quite a, strict diet to just dialing it back to bringing in more,
Mm.
kumara or like sweet potato. And they don't just kind of go, let's bring in a bit more whole food carbs. Unfortunately, it's kind of like this all or nothing situation. They
Yeah.
go from quite strictly low carb to like all the way back to like having, baked, like regular baked goods from the cafe, like bread and just have it. And as soon as for a certain, depending on how bad insulin resistance has been, as soon as you start bringing back all that flour based food, the food noise immediately switches on. I mean,
Right.
that's one of the other mechanisms of a low carb diet is it can switch off that food noise. I hope people know what I mean about this. This like food noise is this incessant, like, what am I going to eat? How can I shouldn't be eating that. How can I eat less of that? It's like, oh, darn, I ate that. It's like just this like, um, for some people, like almost 24/7. I mean,
Yeah.
hopefully not while they're sleeping, but it's,
Yeah.
and as soon as, and a low carb diet is one way to switch that off. I mean, there's other ways, but so yeah, does that do you have other what would you add to that, Tracy? What are your
No, I mean,
what's
it's
your
really interesting. I obviously hear a lot of clients and in discussions, with menopausal women around this kind of, what's the difference between low carb and paleo. And so I think what you've provided, the details that you've provided around what you recommend low carb. And of course, it's different for everyone and everyone's having different starting points. So just the discussions that I've had, I think I agree with that. Um, and when you say that the food noise, yeah, that's really interesting. I can say from personal experience, actually, if I try to adjust things too quickly, because I think, okay, I'm going to have a really good couple of weeks this week because I know it makes me feel better. It clears up my skin. It gives me more clarity. If I go too hard, the food noise dials up a bit much. Like it's like I start
well,
thinking about, oh, what am I having next? Whereas if I actually know how to eat really healthy, and I find that when I stick to something that's working for me, I literally don't think about it. I'm like, I know I'm going to have protein. I know I'm going to have this type of carbohydrates. I don't need this junk food today. I don't actually feel like it. I think over time, you just understand your body a bit better and you know what works for you. It can get really noisy as far as like everything that's out there. So I like to try to keep it as simple and clarify that for people as possible.
yeah.
Mm.
Well, that's the main test, the main metric I invite people to monitor in my book is satiety. So
Mm.
zest and satiety are zest is the test. I'd put so satiety is this feeling like I've had enough food. I'm not. There's no food noise. Satiety would be the absence of food noise, really, and that should be the immediate, fairly immediate result of interventions, like, diet changes. Like it should result in increased satiety. Although there could be the only exception to that would be as if there's food addiction, there's going to be some withdrawal, which is just people need to know about that. But what I was saying is, my experience when a lower carb diet is the right diet, and I think one of the mechanisms that it works as well as the gut health thing, which I talked about before, one of its main mechanisms is that if it's the right thing, a low carb diet should switch off food noise,
Okay.
should increase
I think
satiety.
I'm on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that,
Without
and
thinking about it, actually, I think I'm on that.
doesn't,
Yeah.
if it doesn't, then maybe that's a sign that that's not right. But I was
Yeah.
talking about the patients who like go onto low carb, they do feel more satiety, they do feel great, the food noise goes away, and then but feel just for different reasons that they can't keep it going, and then go back onto refined carbohydrates, and the food noise comes
Yes.
roaring back.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think so that's the one way to think about it. And again, that's not a one size fits all. I mean, I personally don't eat a low carb diet, but I am quite supportive of it for people who are in a situation of more severe insulin resistance, food noise, especially food addiction potentially, which we haven't really talked about. But that's chapter 12 in my book.
Yes. So get the book so you can read about food
Yeah.
addiction. If you think that this is something that is affecting you on the daily. I have one more
Yeah.
question, and I think it
Okay.
kind of summarizes
Okay.
the incredible information that you've provided for us. So how can the
Yeah.
audience implement small practical changes from your book to start repairing their metabolism today?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, the step one is to how can they start implementing? I mean, the process I take in the book is to help people identify their individual metabolic obstacles. So, and it's doable. I mean, hopefully I've managed to sort of talk people through that. But like, just to give another concrete example, if there are really strong gut issues, step one is to fix those gut issues before even you start like
Yeah.
making regimented, a regimen around specific diet and exercise. Diet changes can be part of fixing gut. So that's I guess if you're asking which diet should you do at that point, if there's a lot of gut issues, that do the diet changes that fix your gut. So that would just be one example. I mean, other tangible examples like easy steps, because as you probably saw in the book, with each metabolic obstacle, I rank it as high or moderate priority and easy or
Hmm.
difficult to
Yeah,
fix. So
fantastic. Yeah,
start with the easy wins. So the easy and high priority ones are like, do
do
that,
that.
especially if they're easy. And one example might be trying to align circadian rhythm. That is a win-win for every system in the body. Your microbiome, your brain, everything is going to love that. If you start getting some morning light and sheltering from light in the evening and protein in the morning, that's another circadian rhythm. So
Yeah,
those are all, there's a bunch of tips in the core 2 chapters in the book called Getting What You Need 1 and 2. And, starting with some of those getting what you need, because you have to, just because we're animals, right? So as a biological creature, until you're kind of actually getting everything you need, it's hard to do the next steps.
yeah,
So, and some of those things, getting what you need is social as well. So we really do, it's actually a little crazy how much that affects our biology, just having the right people around us. And I have a section in that, the importance of social connection, about being aware of sabotage too, because sadly, people can have the wrong sort of support around them. And I think this, I mean, I don't know how common it is, but it's out there, this sort of feeling like, I'll just give an example. Like if you say, well, I'm not going to, at a cafe, it's like, I'm not going to have that cake. Like and especially if you say, if I often for my patients say, don't explain yourself, just say, I'm not hungry. Cause then you can just be like, I'm not going to eat that. I'm not having that. I'm having a tea. I'm not eating that. But if you say, oh, it's because I'm trying to be healthier, then unfortunately there can be this like pushback. It's like,
yeah,
well, you can be too healthy, I'm sure a little bit this wouldn't hurt you. And it's like, they're coming from the position of, that other person experienced that as, because they're eating cake, obviously. So they're like, well, you're attacking me by saying this is unhealthy. So there's a lot going on, especially, I want to say, especially for women. Men have some layers around this too, but I'm sure you've encountered that with your clients. I mean, it's not just a matter of here's a list of what you can eat or don't eat. It's like
yeah,
there's the whole, you have to navigate your day. You have to like be, go to family events. You have to day by day make some decisions about these things. And so, yeah, it's good to have some people on your side.
yeah. So circadian rhythm, social connections, good social
Yeah.
connections. Anything else that you want to include before we wrap up?
I'll move your body.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, I couldn't talk with you without saying, build some muscle. I mean, it really, muscle is an endocrine organ. It's a hormonal system. It does help with a lot with everything.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lara. And your book is out now, right?
Oh yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
It's out
So
now.
I'll just send any of the listeners, if you're interested in the Metabolism Reset, highly recommend,
Great.
and the other books that Lara has written, which are, have been a lifesaver for my daughter. So thank you very much. I'll put all of that in the show notes, and you can connect with Lara there. I'll pop her website in there as well. So thank you so